Hi guys, welcome to the Brain Guys YouTube channel. It is 2 p.m. where I'm recording, and today I'm going to be telling you guys about the circulation of the brain. Starting out here, we have a nice little picture of the underside of the brain. We have the cerebellum in the back. We have the temporal lobe on the side, as well as a cutaway section on this side. We have the frontal lobe over here, and this white section over here is the olfactory nerve, an olfactory bulb, and we have the optic chiasm back here, which then goes on to lead to the optic nerves. And this little circle over here is the hypothalamus. Now, the circulation to the brain can basically be divided into two sources, the anterior source and the posterior source. The anterior source is the internal carotid artery, and the posterior source is the vertebral artery. Now, the internal carotid artery comes from the front of the neck, while the vertebral artery comes up through the transverse foramina of your spinal column in the back of the neck. Now, both of these two circulation points meet up here in this ring-like structure called the circle of Willis. In this structure, we have the internal carotid artery meeting up with the branches of the vertebral artery and forming this ring. And one of the benefits of this ring is that if you ever have clots or blocks to any part of it, you are still ensured that circulation reaches the other parts of the brain. And this is very important as the brain is a very, very high demand organ. Even a few minutes without oxygen or other nutrients can drastically change cellular function and eventually lead to cellular death within 5 minutes. So now we're going to go a bit more in depth in the blood vessels and their branches that make up the circulation to the brain. I understand that this looks a little complicating and intimidating at first, but I promise after we dive into it, it should be cleared up. So let's start with the vertebral artery back here. It provides circulation primarily to this structure back here. This all is the brainstem. It provides the most base functions for life. So the vertebral artery climbs up the sides of it and branches over here to create something called the basilar artery. So you have your two vertebral arteries, they connect to make the basilar artery. Now, the vertebral artery has two main things coming off of it. It has the anterior spinal artery, which comes off of the middle, and this provides blood flow all the way down the spine on the anterior side. And it has the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. This comes off the sides, and this provides blood flow to the bottom half of the cerebellum. Now, after the two vertebral arteries have fused into the basilar artery, they form three branches. Anterior inferior cerebellar artery, which provides blood flow to the middle of the cerebellum, the superior cerebellar artery up here, which provides blood flow to the top of the cerebellum, and finally the posterior cerebral artery. And that's where the basilar artery splits and ends. Also in the middle, the basilar artery has tiny, tiny branches called the pontine arteries, but they aren't as big. So now that gives us three cerebellar arteries, the anterior inferior cerebellar, the posterior inferior cerebellar, and the superior cerebellar artery, one of which comes off of the vertebral artery, this one, and two of which come off of the basilar artery. That's pretty much the posterior circulation of your brain. Now, moving on to the anterior circulation of the brain. This comes from the internal carotid artery, which enters right over here. Now, as the internal carotid artery enters, it immediately branches into multiple things, the biggest of which turns out to be the middle cerebral artery, over here. Now, we have the middle cerebral artery, we have the posterior cerebral artery, which comes off of the basilar, as we just talked about, and then we have the anterior cerebral artery, which is another branch of the internal carotid artery. Now, the anterior cerebral artery flows this way and provides circulation to the center of the brain. The middle cerebral artery flows laterally and provides circulation to the outer sides of the brain. Now, the posterior cerebral artery flows back here underneath the temporal lobe and provides blood flow to the occipital and parietal lobes. Now, these three are the biggest arteries that provide circulation for almost all of your cerebrum. You can also see here that we have smaller ones that go in between. The anterior communicating artery connects the two anterior cerebral arteries together, and the posterior communicating artery connects the middle cerebral and posterior cerebral arteries together. Now, that forms a ring-like structure between these three very high-load arteries, and this ensures that if you have clots or blockages in any one of these branches, you still have the best chance of providing your brain with as much circulation as it needs. Now, understanding the circulation in all of its branches can be very complicated and intimidating, but I found that the best way to do it and actually have it stick to your memory is to try drawing it yourself. So, we start over here with two vertebral arteries. They meet in the middle and form the basilar artery. The vertebral arteries have their own branches, one of which is the anterior spinal artery, and one of which is the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. The basilar artery has its own branches, three. It has the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, It has the superior cerebellar artery, and at the end of it, it breaks off into two posterior cerebral arteries. So these three are your cerebellar arteries. The posterior cerebral artery goes with the middle cerebral artery and anterior cerebral artery in terms of organization. Now, for the top part of the circulation, you have your middle cerebral artery, which comes off of your internal carotid artery. Off the middle cerebral artery comes the anterior cerebral artery. Connecting the two anterior cerebral arteries is the anterior communicating. And connecting the middle cerebral artery to the posterior cerebral artery is the posterior communicating. So definitely drawing this a couple of times out, seeing how much of it you can get from memory is one of the best ways to fully commit it to memory. Even after drawing it a couple of times like this, it can still be a bit difficult to really get locked into your head. So I found that one of the better ways to help it stick even more is to think of it as a picture when you're drawing it. And one of the best pictures I've thought of when drawing the circulation of the brain is to think of it as almost a little dog with a house sitting on top of its head. As you can see here, you have the dog's little nose. You have the anterior spinal artery making the midline of it. You have the upper and lower parts of the eye made by the superior cerebellar and anterior inferior cerebellar, which are branches of the basilar. You have the posterior cerebral artery making the top of its head. And then you have the anterior circulation made by the internal carotid artery, with the PCOM making the walls, the anterior cerebral artery making the roof with the anterior communicating connecting them, and then the middle cerebral artery making sort of the gutters of the house. Now, this may seem a little silly, but I found that the silliest memory devices are oftentimes the ones that stick the longest, and I can for sure tell you that this way of thinking of it has helped me memorize the circulation to the brain the best, and I hope it ends up working for you too. Thank you.